And joining us at the roundtable this week is Brian Mann from North Country Public Radio. Welcome back. Nice to see you.
Thanks
You
for having me.
have undertaken quite an amazing project over the past several months, and it's a year-long project, a radio documentary that's looking into the drug laws in this country and here in New York State, and basically what came out of those.
It really developed right here in the North Country. You know, being a reporter here for the last 14 years or so, I realized that we have this amazingly large prison industry. You know, Mariah, Chateauguay, Lion Mountain, Malone.
Probably about 20 in all, right?
Yeah.
20-some across the North Country.
Huge employer, huge driver of the economy. Many places are municipal water systems and sewer systems are actually hardwired into these prisons. So it's really part of what we do in the North Country. And we started asking ourselves, where did this come from? How did we become a prison community, really? And we also realized that this was the 40th anniversary of passage of these Rockefeller drug laws. So 40 years ago, this year, Governor Nelson Rockefeller pushed these really tough new drug laws, sending people to prison for a long time for marijuana, cocaine, heroin.
In most cases, nonviolent offenders.
In a lot of cases, nonviolent offenders, and we wanted to sort of connect the dots there. What happens when you begin to change the society's way of thinking about crime and punishment and justice? We went from being a society that locked up very few people, we had very small prison systems in the United States, to being the largest prison country on earth. And you know, again, the North Country is a microcosm of that, but nationally 2.2 million people behind bars, and many of them on nonviolent low-level crimes. It's created a whole new industry, a whole new way of thinking about everything from race relations to rural economies. A huge part of rural America now has become prison-based in terms of how we employ people.
In the past few years, there has been a move to re-examine these laws.
We saw the Rockefeller drug laws repealed when Governor David Paterson, our first African-American governor, was in office. And of course, these laws have affected the black community in terms of incarceration rates to a much higher level. Many blacks see them as being racist laws and unfair, and he led the effort to repeal them. And that has led to a plummeting incarceration rate here in New York State. There are 70% fewer drug felons in our jails and prisons now than there were just a decade ago. 70% decline, large part because of those reforms. And again, Tom, what's interesting about this is that it comes right back home to our local lives here in the North Country. We now have another round of prison closures that are on the docket. We've got Chateauguay and Mount McGregor here in the North Country. We just had Lion Mountain Correctional Facility sell. Camp Gabriel's is sitting empty. And as these inmate populations continue to decline, as we reevaluate these policies, you know, there are going to be big questions asked about other prison towns across the North Country as well. Mariah, Raybrook, Malone, and Ogdensburg. You know, this is things that are getting talked about around the dinner table all across the North Country.
And there's resistance because even though politicians and community leaders can look at the numbers and say, yes, the prison population is dropping, these are such an important part of the North Country. They provide thousands of jobs, they have for generations, and there isn't exactly a lot of industry that's waiting to come in here. And I know that's a big argument, that perhaps other prisons in other parts of New York, Sing Sing on the Hudson River and others, could be redeveloped much easier than prisons sitting empty up here in the North Country. And you use those two examples. Gabriel's is still sitting empty. Lion Mountain sold after a couple of years to the lowest bidder. Right. And so one of the big arguments is that there just isn't industry to come in and replace these jobs.
That's right. There are really two, as we look at the resistance movement to closing these prisons, there are two things that get talked about a lot. One is whether we're closing prisons at a rate that means too many of the prisons that are left are overcrowded. And a lot of corrections officers and their representatives say that they're still too crowded, double bunked inmates, and therefore it's unsafe in those conditions. So that's one argument that we've been looking at. And there's a real debate over whether that's accurate. The other is this economic picture that you're talking about. And this is really one of the most interesting problems that we've uncovered in our reporting, is that you have this risky moment when you have a largely white rural community, which is what we are, basing our prosperity and our livelihoods on the business of locking up mostly black and Hispanic people from the inner cities. And so obviously it's important for us. We've needed this. Ron Stafford, the Plattsburgh state senator, really helped to create this system up here, and he believed that it was a good livelihood. He was himself the son of a corrections worker in Dannemora, believed that this was a good and an ethical industry for the North Country to take on. But at the same time, you have this very challenging policy debate when you have white lawmakers pushing for tough laws to lock up what turn out to be mostly black people and Hispanic people, benefiting economically mostly white people. And so one of the things that we've really tried to slowly unpack and wrestle with is what has it done for North Country economies? Has it provided a good, robust base for our communities? Has it been an ethical kind of work for us to do? Who's benefited, who's suffered? And those are really complicated questions. Many things have made this an amazingly lucky year to be taking on this challenge. One of those issues is that the great financial crisis in America led to many states, many local jurisdictions beginning to belt tighten. And one of the places that people have looked is these massive prison systems. And so when you look at the reform of our prison system in New York or the prison system in California or Texas, part of it is that people reevaluated the ethics of these laws. Did it make sense to lock somebody up for 15 years for having a bag of marijuana? Was that the right thing to do? But the other question that's driving this is simple economics. Can Albany afford to run this many prisons in the rural North Country? Does it make financial sense? Can taxpayers afford it?
You're producing an hour-long documentary that you hope will air potentially nationally on NPR. A project of this magnitude just really isn't tackled by many broadcasters and journalists in this day and age. The commitment, a year-long expose, the number of stories, dozens and dozens of stories. So this really says something about the commitment in North Country Public Radio to tackle an issue like this head-on like this and commit to this.
Yeah, and you know, that's where we've got this Kickstarter project that we're doing, which is, if people haven't heard about it, it's this new kind of grassroots funding thing that you go online and you can chip in $1, you can chip in $10 to support it, and that's because, you know, let's be honest, the business model for investigative, in-depth journalism just doesn't really work very well anymore. We've seen big newspapers going out of business. We've seen big television stations laying off many of their reporters, closing bureaus. And so what we're doing with this project is sort of as an act of faith. We've said we need to ask these questions. We need to engage this debate, and we hope that people will help us pay for it in the most grassroots possible way. And so that's the experiment that we're in the middle of right now. For me as a journalist, I've been doing this for 25 years. This is an effort to fund this one project, but it's also an experiment to see whether I'll be able to do this kind of work in the future. If this works, then I will immediately begin planning my next big investigative project. And I'll be thinking, okay, we've got a business plan that will help make this happen. If it doesn't work, you know, guys like me who are just old-fashioned journalists and reporters, we're really going to have to go back to the drawing board and say, you know, how do we do this? How do we do the kind of civic journalism, the kind of deep storytelling? I mean, we've had to go all over the country. We've had to spend hours and hours digging through old archives, digging through old legal records, digging through finding documents and papers that people didn't want us to find. And that kind of shoe leather journalism, you know, it's getting harder and harder to do. So we'll see if this works.
You have found some real gems in your investigative work across the country.
We're going to change, by the time this project is over, we are going to change people's understanding of the history of the American drug war. The war on drugs that began with Richard Nixon, we're sort of at maybe the tail end of it now with the Attorney General, Eric Holder, talking about rolling back federal mandatory minimum sentencing laws. This 40-year history changed America, changed us fundamentally as a people, changed the way we think about race, crime, justice, and our little public radio station has been digging and finding bits of information, including, as you say, this historic meeting between black lawmakers and President Richard Nixon in the White House back in the 1970s that helped lay the groundwork for the war on drugs. Nobody's ever heard of this event before. It's sort of one of the bits of history that we're revealing in this series.
Does this put you in a new or difficult position where in the past, working for public radio, you've had to encourage listeners to support your radio station. But is this new uncharted territory where the journalists have to go out and basically help drum up the funds so they can do their investigative work?
Absolutely, and it's really uncomfortable for me. I mean, it's uncomfortable because, you know, the historic, and I think the best way for this to work is that there's a firewall between the people who deal with the money and the people who go out and report the stories. And I'll tell you, one of the things I'm a big believer in, and this is old school in journalism, is I believe that one of the primary jobs of a journalist is not to be liked very much. I am very comfortable with people being very unhappy with me because I'm telling stories that make people squirm. That's part of what I get paid to do. And so if halfway through my day of making people squirm, I also have to turn around and say, look, you know, we need a few dollars to keep going. Those are two very different roles to play. And often similar people are in the room at those moments. And so it's a balancing act. It is the new reality of modern American journalism that we have to find ways to juggle and still keep the ethics right square in front of us. And so I will say about this Kickstarter project, the thing that I love about it is that it's really transparent. It's really transparent. You can go there and you can see the name of every single person who's donated. So when we're done and you want to say, well, who gave to this? Who was behind it financially? You know, it'll be utterly visible there. And so as we make these compromises going forward, this is maybe one of the best compromises I could see to make.
Go to northcountrypublicradio.org to hear all the stories that you've been doing in this series. Brian, Mann, thanks a lot for taking the time.
Thanks, Tom.